The bag weighed more than it should have. Clara registered it the moment the leather cleared the shelf. A dull, settled heaviness that had nothing to do with the surgical instruments she'd already pictured inside. She stood with it in both hands and breathed in what it smelled like, something between dried antiseptic and rust. The carbolic and institutional bleach pressed so deep into the cracked leather over decades that it wasn't a scent on the material anymore so much as a property of it. Underneath that was the specific smell of iron that has been sweating in a damp basement through enough New England winters to stop being rust on something and become rust as something. She set it on the edge of the shelf and pressed both palms flat against the sides and felt the cold come back through her fingers. The leather had calcified into its final shape. Dark brown gone almost black at the creases. Pale gray dust collected in the ridges, no longer soft enough to yield when she pressed her thumb into it. She'd spent 26 years moving patients, carts, equipment through hospital corridors, and her wrists knew the difference between a bag that was empty and this one that was hiding something. She pressed the brass latch. It didn't move. She pierced harder with the heel of her right palm until the edge of the brass cut into the pad of her hand, held the pressure. The latch resisted for another 3 seconds and then cracked open with a sound she felt in her back teeth, and the bag fell apart at the seam like a thing that had been holding itself together a long time. Inside the top layer, a vintage surgical kit, a scalpel handle, tenaculum forceps, a glass syringe casing with the plunger dried into place, standard wartime physician's travel instruments. Nothing that would explain why Clara Vance was standing in an unheated sub-level at early morning, with $6.12 to her name and rust from the latch already drying brown across her palm. What it would not explain was that her name was no longer on the Vance Family Medical Trust. Her brothers had taken 3 years to construct that outcome. The morning before, in a conference room on the 14th floor of their glass headquarters tower, they had finished it. She had the bag. The latch was open. The will reading had been scheduled for 9 in the morning. Julian and Marcus Vance arrived at 1:45. They always arrived early to things they intended to own. The conference room was in the Vance Meridian building. Their attorney at the head of the table in a suit that had cost more than 3 months of Clara's take-home. Julian wore the Rolex Submariner he'd bought himself the day their first hospital campus broke ground. Marcus kept on the cashmere overcoat he'd been cultivating as a habit since the company crossed its first revenue threshold. The kind of coat that signals, without anyone having to say so, that its wearer doesn't plan to stay long enough to need a hook. Their grandfather, Dr. Ellsworth Vance, had died at 89 with the same precision of mind that had defined his practice. He had been a general practitioner in Fall River for nearly 40 years, built his patient load by word of mouth through the post-war years, and never once allowed Julian or Marcus into his original clinic without a prior appointment. Both of them had thought this was eccentricity. Clara had always understood it as a form of professional respect for the work and for the people receiving it. Julian received a controlling share and the family real estate holdings and the primary executor authority. Marcus received a secondary share, plus full access to the family investment portfolio. Clara received a handwritten note directing her to the sub-level locker room of Harrington General's original East Wing, where a personal item had been stored since 1978. The attorney read this without inflection. He was the kind of attorney who had learned not to itch either in rooms like this. Julian checked his watch before he finished. He said it the way you say contaminated. The basement. He said it the way you say contaminated.
Look at this.
There are personal
Page
effects in
47.
the old clinic
Your
storage,
department
the
is
attorney
hemorrhaging
confirmed.
money.
Marcus
I
didn't
expect
look
a
up from his
resolution by
phone.
end of
We're
day.
not walking through a
That's
condemned
impossible.
sub-level for personal
You
effects.
need to understand
Clara
how
can manage
critical
that.
this situation
That
is.
seems appropriate.
We are
He said
running out of
appropriate in a
time,
way that meant
and I
beneath
need your
us.
full
The
cooperation
city flagged that
right
section
now.
in the building inspection from a few years back, Julian added, adjusting the Rolex on his wrist. Moisture readings alone. I'm not exposing myself to a liability claim for old instruments. It's a waste of time. Neither of them asked what was down there. The assumption rusted equipment, old paperwork, nothing worth an inconvenience, was already settled in their minds before the meeting had started. They left carrying between them more real estate than most small counties. They did not look back. Clara took the elevator down. The bag sat on the third shelf from the left, pushed against the back wall. Dr. Ellsworth Vance had written her name on a strip of surgical tape in his careful slanted hand and pressed it to the side. She carried the bag upstairs, drove back to her apartment, and set it on her kitchen table before she allowed herself to think about what she might be holding. She drove north the next morning through horizontal rain. A long drive across state lines to eastern Vermont, the two-lane state road slowed to a crawl through Windham County. A gravel track off the county road converted by overnight rain into a shallow running stream. Clara had driven on worse. She'd also eaten nothing since the morning before. A familiar was deteriorating, for the monitors showed it. She used hunger when it came before the monitors it came, the way her grandfather had once described it to her. The body stops filtering known essentials. You see more clearly. She needed that now. She parked where the track ended and walked the rest of the way in. Her shoes were waterlogged before she reached the halfway point. She noted this and kept going. The building announced itself through smell, before it was visible through the trees, wet clay and old timber. And underneath that something structural, the cold molding ground since the foundation, that had been holding ground thence since the 40s. The old medical supply depot had been active through the war years, servicing county clinics across 2 states. By the morning Clara arrived, it was partially collapsed at the north roof line and bowed along the east wall in a diagonal crack that ran floor to ceiling. The door, a single warped pine, required her full body weight to open, and when it gave suddenly. She stumbled one step into the dark. Inside was cold in the way of places where warmth has been absent long as just stop being a recent absence and become a permanent condition. Her breath hung in the air. In the far corner, beneath collapsed ceiling board, the outline of a built-in storage cabinet ran floor to ceiling along the west wall. She'd almost stopped at the door. The ceiling above the cabinet had bowed, and when she stepped toward it, the sound it produced was significant, compressed, strained. She stood still and listened. Strain, not imminent failure. She continued. The cabinet lock, a simple pin 1940s manufacture, was her grandfather had been here. He'd unlocked piz open. That was a decision. He had never made accidents that looked like decisions. She moved ceiling debris aside with a length of timber from near the door and pulled the cabinet open. Cedar smell first. Beneath it, the dry particular scent of paper that had been deliberately protected. Not paper that had simply survived, but paper someone had meant to outlast the building around it. Clara had spent 26 years in environments where the difference between what had survived via accident and what had been preserved as spots was clinically significant. She knew what deliberate protection looked like. Every interior surface of the cabinet had been lined with a rubberized moisture barrier. She later identified as wartime military medical supply storage material. The same specification used for surgical in that theater. Shipped to field hospitals, all in the Pacific. The lining was intact on all 6 surfaces, and the cedar chips stacked along the lower shelves were dry. Someone had gone to considerable expense and care, and had been right too. The shelves held 3 items: a small leather ledger sealed in wax cloth, a glass jar enclosing a roll of film, and what appeared to be a solid cabinet floor. Clara measured the interior depth against the exterior. She did this automatically, the way she took a pulse, not as a decision but as reflex, because it was the kind of checking that had never once wasted her time. The interior ran roughly 4 inches shorter than the exterior dimensions required. She pressed along the bottom panel until she found the seam, 3 sides nearly invisible in the low light, and in the right front corner a recessed catch no larger than a thumbnail. She pressed it. The panel lifted. What lay beneath was wrapped in oilcloth, heavy and waxed, doubled over at both ends and sealed with a dried compound she recognized from its color and texture as a field-grade wound adhesive used through the 1940s. Her grandfather had trained as a wartime physician's assistant before completing his medical degree. He knew what would hold, and for how long. Her hands were not entirely steady when she unwrapped it. The document was a land deed executed in 1946. The parcel, A plot in the Fall River Medical District, notarized and witnessed and recorded, then caught in a municipal filing backlog during a records modernization in the early 70s. Never formally digitized into the modern land registry index. Never challenged because no one searching standard channels would have had any reason to know it was there. It had simply sat in the archive, invisible to any title search conducted through the contemporary system. Clara read the boundary coordinates twice. Then she sat down on the cabinet floor, because those coordinates corresponded precisely to the parcel where Vance Meridian Health Group had broken ground on their regional headquarters expansion. Julian had announced the project at a press event, photographs and a handshake with the city planner. The projected cost $20 million in construction and acquisition financing. The land beneath it had been registered to Dr. Ellsworth James Vance since 1946. She photographed every surface of the document and folded the original into her coat's interior pocket and sat very still for a while. She was a precise person, and she was allowing herself a moment of imprecision, of not quite believing what she was looking at, before she made herself start thinking about what came next. Then headlights swept across the gap in the bowed east wall. 2 car doors. Marcus's voice first, then Julian's behind it, already disagreeing before they'd cleared the tree line how they'd found her. Clara could reconstruct the likely path. Julian maintained a close relationship with the estate attorney, whose offices shared a building with a title research firm the Vance organization used regularly. A parcel search in the Fall River Medical District, the coordinates she'd run the previous evening from her grandfather's files, would have tripped an alert in the expansion project's active monitoring. That was her best reconstruction. Standing in the depot, she only knew that her brothers had known to come. Julian came through the warped door first. He'd traded the morning suit for dark trousers and a performance fabric jacket. He surveyed the collapsed interior briefly, found Clara by the open cabinet, and settled into the particular composure of a person who has decided they already understand the situation. "You found something," he said. She said nothing. Marcus followed, carrying a folder, and set it on the remnant of a supply shelf near the door, with the efficiency of someone presenting a closing argument rather than entering a building. The expansion project has full legal grounding. The parcel has been assessed as unregistered municipal land for over 40 years. We commissioned a professional survey. The boundary coordinates are on file with the city. File a competing claim if you have documentation, Julian said. He kept his voice measured and unhurried. You have 7 days. After that, our attorneys proceed on the assumption the title is clear. He looked around at the collapsed ceiling, the bowed east wall, the general condition of the space. You shouldn't be in here. The structure isn't safe. It wasn't concern, it was punctuation. The close of a subject he was no longer interested in. They left. The pine door banged shut behind them, and the folder Marcus had set down slid from the shelf in the draft. Clara picked it up. 3 pages from the corporate survey filed with the city, the expansion's eastern boundary marked in red along the coordinate line. She read those numbers, then she read the coordinates on her grandfather's deed. The survey placed the expansion's eastern boundary at a specific grid reference. The deed placed the registered eastern boundary of the parcel at a point 14 feet and 3 inches further west. The discrepancy was consistent with the coordinate transposition. 2 adjacent decimal values switched during manual entry, the kind of error that happens when a surveyor is copying field measurements into a digital system at the end of a long day, and no one checks the copy against the original. It was a small error. It placed the entire eastern face of the expansion on land that did not belong to Vance Meridian law. The original registered deed land holds priority over a subsequent administrative survey. Had 7 days. Clara had 7. She calculated she would need 3 if the land office cooperated. She had no particular reason to believe it would. She was in the parking lot of the Fall River City land office before it opened, with the deed, a hand-drafted boundary comparison, and documentation she'd pulled from the Massachusetts Land Court's online archival registry. The original 1946 filing confirmation, digitized in the early 2000s and publicly accessible to anyone who searched both the modern index and the historical one. Julian and Marcus's attorney had searched only the modern one. The archival filing had been sitting there, somewhere beyond where his search stopped. The title examiner, at the front counter, asked twice whether she had an attorney, suggested she might want to return with representation before filing anything, and noted that competing claims on active commercial parcels moved on a timeline that might exceed her window. Clara asked him to log the date and time on the intake form and set the deed on the counter. He looked at it and went to get his supervisor. The supervisor was a woman named Hargrove, with 31 years in land title and the manner of someone who had stopped being surprised by the things people brought her. She spent a few minutes with the documents and asked Clara 3 precise questions about the archival filing. Then she said the office would need to authenticate the deed through the state land court before the claim could proceed to formal review. 5 to 10 business days. Clara said that was fine. Hargrove looked at her. Are you represented? Not yet. You Hargrove said, and went back to her office. Clara found a contingency attorney that afternoon. Not the most expensive one she'd spoken to, but the one who asked the right questions. The authentication came back in 6 days. The deed was valid. Julian and Marcus's lead attorney filed a motion arguing that the 5-decade gap between the deed's recording and its practical assertion constituted constructive abandonment. That sitting on a legal claim for that length of time with acting was functionally a surrender. The formal hearing convened 12 days after Clara's filing. She appeared with her attorney. Julian and Marcus brought 3 attorneys from a firm billed at rates high enough to appear as a line item in the summary. Leather briefcases, calibrated composure, the bearing of people who had walked into rooms like this before and expected to leave them in better shape than their opposition. Their lead attorney argued the constructive abandonment position carefully. It was not an unreasonable argument. Clara watched Hargrove, seated as examiner, listen to it with the expression of someone hearing a familiar thing. Hargrove asked him to cite the specific Massachusetts statute defining the abandonment threshold for a registered deed. He cited the wrong one. The statute he named had been amended in 2003 in a way that specifically excluded recorded deeds from its provisions. The attorney had missed the amendment. Julian understood what had happened 4 seconds before his attorney finished speaking. Clara watched his expression move from calculation to something else. Not how to win the room, but how to name the loss at the press event. Marcus had gone very still beside him, the cashmere coat folded in his lap, his phone face down on the table. For the first time all morning, Hargrove ruled in Clara's favor that afternoon. Outside the building, Marcus was already on his phone. Julian fell into step beside Clara for several paces before he spoke. Before you went in, you already knew what was in the bag. No, she said. She knew there was something worth knowing. He stopped, she didn't. The land court's ruling held through every subsequent challenge. Without Clara's authorization, the expansion could not proceed on its current footprint. The choice Vance Meridian faced was negotiate or abandon a foundation already sunk in the ground. Their attorneys requested a negotiated purchase within 3 weeks of the ruling. The independent appraisal, the independent figure defeat just under $40 million, reflecting the parcel's position in the medical district, and the degree to project had already committed to its boundary lines. The settlement closed at the full amount. Marcus's share was substantially offset by the firm's accumulated legal fees. 4 months later, a secondary audit of the Vance family trust identified irregularities in its administration going back several years. Julian became subject to civil proceedings that remained ongoing. Marcus resigned from the organization's board. Clara used the bulk of the settlement to establish a non-profit primary care network across rural southern Massachusetts and Vermont. She named it Ellsworth. 7 clinic locations, 31 full-time nurses on staff, each paid above the regional median, with benefits that don't expire when a funding cycle ends. She kept the bag. It sits on the desk in the home office of a house she owns outright in Fall River. In the mornings, when the light comes in from the east, it catches the brass latch that required the healer from a more pressure than expected before it finally gave. In a room with no heat, in a basement no one else was willing to enter. Her grandfather had known when he pressed her name onto that strip of surgical tape, that she would be the one to come. She had always been the one who entered the difficult rooms, the work others considered beneath their attention. He hid the deed precisely where people who believed their position excused them from inconvenience would refuse to look. He left it for someone who would follow a recessed catch into a false bottom, who would recognize a moisture barrier by texture, who would not turn back when the ceiling was making noise. What he had concealed and where made complete sense once you understood what kind of person he had been, and what kind of person she had always been.